Hello, Madison Avenue. Good to see you once again today. Getting ready for our Bible study here Wednesday evening on April the 8th, and looking forward to diving into this with you today. We're still in the book of John. I've adjusted our study. If you remember, we originally started out as a 10-week study, but we've added a little bit here and there, which has been fine. But I've extended it out now to a 13-week study. So we are in lesson number 12. The 12th week, and I'm hoping to wrap everything up next week. Of course, we'll see how time goes. We might have to take it out an additional week, but I'm hoping to wrap everything up by next Wednesday night. So I hope that you will pay attention to what we're going to be looking at today. We've got a lot of stuff to get to this afternoon in this 12th lesson. We're all the way down in chapter number 18. So if you would, make sure you've already read this going into our lesson. If you've not had a chance to read it, as soon as you're done watching the Bible study this evening, I encourage you to open up your Bibles and read it for yourself. So we're going to be in chapter number 18 tonight. We're also going to be in the first half of chapter number 19. We're not going to get all the way through 19 because 18 has so much stuff packed into it. So let's get right to it. Again, I encourage you to read it on your own. Let's start looking at our outline today. The outline, once again, the guide can be found on our Facebook page. If you'll go there, you'll be able to find it on a post that should have gone live just a minute or two before this video goes live. And when you see it, you can download it there. You can look at it on your computer, or you can print it off and have a hard copy of it. But the study guide should be available for you there on Facebook in PDF form to download, okay? Tonight, let's begin in chapter number 18. We're going to be looking at, we've shifted our focus now from Jesus' final words and his final sermons and his final teachings. Now we're going to shift our focus to his death, burial, and resurrection. And so that's what we'll be looking at tonight and next Wednesday as well. But chapter number 18 begins with the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. Now, there's a whole lot more information we can find in the other Gospels. That's the beauty of this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written in such a way where they all tell the same stories, but from a little bit of a different standpoint, from a little bit of a different view, where we can look at each one and we can say, okay, this is the same story, but here's a new detail. Here's a new piece of information. And so John is going to give us his information, some of his detail, but I would encourage you to go back and harmonize those gospel scriptures. There are several different resources out there that you can get a hold of where you can go and you can find exactly where each of these are in the Gospels, and you'll be able to see the other stories, the other Gospels, and the account that they have about the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus, and kind of how all that folds together. But John's account here in chapter number 18 is starting in verses 1 through 11, dealing with the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus. Well, at the end of Jesus' discourse, he's just got done talking to his disciples, teaching them, showing them everything that they needed to do. Now it's after the Passover meal. It's after the Lord's Supper. Christ has instituted all of that. Judas Iscariot is now gone. He's been dismissed. And he's going to go do what he needs to do, and the devil has entered into him, and he's going to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And all of this is kind of culminating to the point where Jesus and his disciples have now gone out from the upper room, and as they leave the upper room, the Bible tells us that they're going up into the Mount of Olives. So they're going to have to cross the brook Kidron. They're going to have to cross the valley there, and as they cross that valley, go up into the Mount of Olives, they're going to a place that we know today as the Garden of Gethsemane. A couple of the Gospels use that term. John does not use that term. John just says that they go to a garden. And here's what's really interesting about it. John gives us some detail here that the other accounts of the Gospels do not. This was a garden that they obviously visited often. It was a garden that Judas knew about. Judas would have been there. Judas would have been there to pray with Jesus. Judas would have been there to visit. Judas knew everything about this Garden of Gethsemane. It was a place that was visited frequently. And so to arrest Jesus, Judas knew exactly where to go. Judas didn't have to hunt all over the countryside and look up and down the mountain and take several hours. Judas knew exactly where to lead those soldiers. And so at the arrest, Judas is now given at least, the Bible tells us, at least 500 men. Some theologians believe it was maybe as many as 2,000 men, but we know at least 500 men that went with Judas. He was also given officers from the chief priests and from the Pharisees. He was given lanterns, he was given torches, he was given weapons, and all of this to go arrest one man. And so I find that kind of interesting. Maybe you do as well. But Judas was given at least 500 men, weapons, lanterns, torches, officers, Pharisees, and they were all going to arrest one person, and that person was Jesus Christ. But see, while all this is going on, Jesus knew what was happening. Jesus knew that they were on their way. Jesus knew what was going on. In the other Gospels, it gives us the account of Jesus praying and asking God to take that cup from him if it be his will. But then Jesus says, nevertheless, thy will be done. And so Jesus knew what was happening, what was leading up to that point in that moment. And yet when they arrived, when Judas arrived and when the guards arrived and the soldiers arrived, Jesus still asked, who are you looking for? And so Jesus is wanting kind of Judas to take responsibility for his actions here. And so the soldiers, they came to Jesus and they said, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. We're looking for Jesus, the one who calls himself the Christ. And Jesus says, I am he. And that term, I am, is a powerful term. It's a term that goes all the way back to the days of Exodus. And so it's a very important term throughout the gospel, not only through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the gospel of the entire Bible from going back to Exodus. And so we see a very, very important term here. Jesus says, I am he. Well, John records something very interesting here. At the sound of Jesus' voice, at the sound of Jesus saying, I am, John records that the men fell backwards, that they lost their balance, that the utterance of the term I am shook them to their core, and they literally fell backwards to the ground. And so we can see the power of the words of God here. We can see the power of Jesus. We can see that simply by saying I am, he's knocking soldiers over. Well, Jesus, who was always concerned about his disciples, always concerned, if you remember just the chapter before, chapter number 17, he was going and praying to God for his disciples. He was praying to the Father, saying, Father, take care of them, guide them, protect them, help them to do what they need to do. And so Jesus, always thinking about his disciples, he comes to Judas, he comes to these officers, he comes to these soldiers, these at least 500 men, and Jesus says this. He says, listen, you've got me, now let these, my disciples, let these go their way. And so Jesus is trying to convince them, listen, you don't need to arrest Peter, you don't need to arrest these other men that are here, you don't need to arrest John, you've got me, you came for me, let them go. And so I think that's neat to see that Jesus always has our best needs always first in his mind. Well, at all of this, Peter gets angry. And we see Peter is a very passionate man. Peter wears his passion on his sleeve, we might say. And he gets angry, he gets upset. They're taking away his Lord, they're taking away Jesus. And so he draws his sword out, and the Bible records that he cut the ear off of a man named Malchus. Well, Malchus, after getting his ear cut off, I can almost imagine he's kind of in shock. He can't believe what just happened. And Jesus tells Peter to put the sword away. He says, Peter, we're not doing that. This isn't a battle. We're not fighting this today. I need to go. This is what I need to do. This is my purpose. This is the goal of me being here. In the other Gospels, it actually records that Jesus put Malchus's ear back on and miraculously healed him. And so we see that this took place here at the betrayal and the arrest of Jesus Christ. Well, as the chapter continues on, the next couple of verses, verses 12 through 14, are dealing with Jesus facing two men. Jesus is going to be arrested. He's going to be brought back into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and he's going to face two men, one named Annas and one named Caiaphas. And as Annas and Caiaphas here are related physically, they are father-in-law and son-in-law, we also see that they've got a very close connection in the offices that they held. Annas held the office of high priest for about 10 years. And now, as Jesus is being arrested and brought into town, we can see this is Caiaphas' first year as the high priest. And so Annas is still very new to all of this. Annas is experienced in all this, Caiaphas is new in all of this. And so we see that as Jesus is bound and brought into town, he's first brought to Annas, which is interesting. Because Annas was not the high priest, technically. Caiaphas was. But because Annas was the elder, because he was the high priest for about 10 years, the Jews brought him to Annas first. The Romans had come in and they had removed Annas as the high priest, and it's the Romans who actually set Caiaphas in charge. So you can see now this is nothing like in the days of Aaron and Eleazar and all those priests back in the Old Testament, where they would serve their entire life until their life was over, and then their son would take over for them, or a nephew would take over. Somebody in the family would take over. By the time we get to the time of Jesus, it has now become 100% political. The position of high priest is bid upon, it is voted on, it is assigned by the Romans, it is assigned by the Sanhedrin. We see all kinds of different things that are going on, and very strange things, and here is an exact case of that. Annas was the high priest for about 10 years, but the Romans didn't like what he was doing. They removed him from power, and they placed Caiaphas in command. And now that Caiaphas is in command, the Jewish officers are going to bring him into town. They're going to go to Annas first, because Annas has the experience. He's the elder. They're going to show that they still reverenced Annas as a high priest, even though he was not serving as the high priest at that time. So now that Annas has kind of investigated him, looked over him, kind of received him, and given some information, now the officers are going to bring him to the current high priest, which is Caiaphas. And Caiaphas thought that Jesus was going to bring some sort of a revolution. Caiaphas thought Jesus was going to cause a problem. Not only was he going to cause a problem in the Jewish community for him and the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, but he also thought that he would cause problems for the Romans. And so these were his thoughts that were recorded, Caiaphas' thoughts recorded in verse number 14. He said, it would be better for us to kill Jesus than for Jesus to just ruin everything. Let's kill Jesus. Let's leave things the way they are. Let's leave the Romans in control. Let's leave the Pharisees in control. Let's leave things how they are, and it's better for us just to kill Jesus and get him out of the way than for Jesus to come in and change everything. And so this is Caiaphas' thought. This is his mind process. He doesn't want to just arrest Jesus. He doesn't want to just imprison Jesus. He wants to kill Jesus. And so we can see Caiaphas' heart, his mind, what he's wanting to do here. So we continue on in chapter number 18. We come to verses 15 through 18, which are dealing with Peter denying Jesus. Now, this is just the first time that Peter denies Jesus. We're going to pick that up here in just a few moments and see the second and third time as well. But the first time that Peter denies Jesus is found here in verses 15 through 18. Peter follows Jesus from a safe distance after being arrested. Jesus is arrested. He's taken into town. He goes to see Annas and Caiaphas. And as he gets there into town, Peter's kind of following behind a little bit. He's wanting to see what happens. Verse number 16 tells us that Peter actually came and stood at the door. He wanted to stand there at the door at the palace of the high priest at Caiaphas' house. He wanted to hear what was going on, see what was happening. You see, Peter couldn't go in. Well, verse number 15 tells us about another disciple that was there. There was another disciple that had followed, but this disciple was a little bit different. It says that this disciple knew the high priest. This disciple was able to go into the high priest's palace. This disciple had access to go where maybe other people couldn't go. And so we kind of get an idea here, and there's two possibilities of who this other disciple was. And we don't know for sure who it was. It's never listed. It's never told to us. But two possibilities, and dare I even say probabilities, of who this other disciple was. And it was probably either Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea. Both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea would have known the high priest. They would have had access to the high priest's house, and both were secret disciples of Jesus. And so I think it was one of those two men. You might think it's someone else, and that's all right. It's not the end of the world one way or the other. But just kind of some interesting things to see there, that there was another disciple that went with them. And as a matter of fact, the Bible tells us that it was this other disciple that saw Peter outside the doors. And so this other disciple goes and gets Peter and brings him in so that Peter can hear and see things better. Well, as this other disciple brings Peter into the house, there's a woman standing outside the house. And this woman, she's kind of the keeper of the door, I guess we could say. And as she's standing there at the door, as Peter walks in, she says, "Oh, I know you. You're one of Jesus' disciples." And Peter says, "Oh, no, I'm not. I'm not one of Jesus' disciples. You got me confused with somebody else." And so this is the first time that Peter denies Jesus. And of course, we know from just a few chapters ago that Jesus prophesied that Peter would deny him 3 times. So this is the first time. Peter says, "I'm not one of his disciples," to the woman that's at the door. And then, being a cool night, Peter went over and warmed himself by the fire of coals. Well, while he's standing there at the fire of coals, guess who else is there? The officers that were there at the Garden of Gethsemane arresting Jesus. So this is setting us up for the next 2 denials that we'll look at here in just a moment. All right. Before we get to those, though, there's another couple of verses here that's given to us in chapter 18, which is verses 19 through 24. And Jesus is questioned now by Caiaphas. He's going to be questioned by the high priest. And the first questions are this. Caiaphas wants to know, number 1, who are your disciples? And number 2, what are you teaching? What is your doctrine, is what the scripture tells us. Who are your disciples and what is your doctrine? Jesus says, listen, I've never hid anything from you. I've never hid anything from anyone. If you want to know who my disciples are, go ask them. Go ask the people. They'll know. You want to know what I teach? You want to know what my doctrine is? Go ask the people. They know. I've never hid anything from anyone. For the past 3 years of my ministry, everyone else knows what's going on. If you're truly curious, I don't need to tell you. You can go ask the people that are out in the courtyard. Well, the way Jesus answered the high priest, one of the officers didn't care for it. One of the officers thought Jesus was answering disrespectfully, or who knows what the case was. But this officer got a little bit upset, and the Bible records that the officer came over and struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, and said, "Do you know who you're speaking to? Do you realize you're speaking to the high priest?" And so Jesus now looks at him and says, "Listen, if I've spoken wrong, if I've said something wrong, then tell me, correct me. But the reality is I've not said anything wrong, and you know it, so why did you hit me?" And so this is kind of an interesting story about the questioning of Jesus there by Caiaphas, about the people that are around. And we can see that things, by the way, and I haven't had a chance to mention this because this is actually in the other Gospels. John doesn't record this verbatim, but we can realize and kind of put a couple of things together here, especially when we look at those other Gospels, that all of this is taking place illegally. Because it's taking place in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, they weren't supposed to be calling these meetings of the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and all this stuff. This was all supposed to be done during the day. And so we can see here that there's a lot of stuff going on that shouldn't be going on. There's things that are being said that aren't accurate, that aren't right. Jesus is already being struck when he doesn't deserve to be struck. He's being questioned with things he doesn't deserve to be questioned with. There's just an awful lot of things that are going on here. And this is just the first half of chapter 18. So as you can see, chapter 18 was just packed full of information. Let's continue on now in verses 25 through 27. Now, this is only a total of 3 verses, but in these 3 verses, Peter's going to deny Jesus 2 more times. We're going to see the second time and the third time that Peter denies Christ. And so the officers that Peter stood with, they were warming up there in front of the coals, in front of the fires. The officers as a whole said, "You are one of his disciples. You have been with Jesus." And Peter a second time says, "No, it's not me. You've got me confused with somebody else. You don't know what you're talking about." Well, now Malchus stands up. Remember from just a few verses ago, Malchus is the man that Peter cut his ear off. If anyone's going to remember who Peter is, it's going to be the dude that got his ear cut off by him. And so now Malchus stands up and he says, "Listen," he says, "I'm the guy that you cut my ear off." Yes, you are. You were in the garden. You were in the garden when we arrested Jesus. Not only were you there, you're the one that cut my ear off. And for a third time, and in one of the other Gospels, I don't remember off the top of my head which one it was. I'm sure we could look it up pretty easily. But one of the other Gospels, it tells us that this third time that Peter cursed. Peter tried to use language. He tried to use words that maybe wouldn't correlate him with Christ. Maybe he was trying to say something and prove that he didn't know Jesus. And this third time as he denies Jesus, the rooster crows. And as that rooster crows, the Bible tells us that Peter wept sorely. He realized what he had done. He remembered what Jesus had said. In the very moment he remembered what Jesus said, Peter ran out crying and weeping. Asking for forgiveness because he could not believe, Peter couldn't believe what he had done. And so all of this was prophesied by Jesus just a few days earlier. So very interesting. Only a short 3 verses, but a lot of stuff in those 3 short little verses. All right, verses 28 through 32 now are dealing with Jesus, who is now going to go before Pilate. Jesus is now led from Caiaphas' house to the judgment hall of Pilate. Pilate wants to know what the charges are. Pilate's like, "I don't even want to see this guy. Who is he? I want to know what he's done." And so the officers say, "Listen, if all he had done was told a lie, or all he had done was stole a loaf of bread, we'd take care of it ourselves. But Pilate, you've got to take care of him. This is an evil man. We would not have brought him to you if he wasn't." And so Pilate reluctantly, he didn't really want to try him, but reluctantly he said, "Fine, whatever. I wish you would handle it as the Jews. I wish you would take care of it. But if he really is an evil man, I'll go in and I'll question him and we'll get to the bottom of this." So the reality is this. The Jews wanted to kill him, but they didn't have authority to do so. So it didn't matter if Jesus, all he had done was steal a loaf of bread, or if anything else for that matter. The Jews wanted to kill him, and they couldn't kill him, and so they needed to take him to Pilate. And so that's why he was brought to Pilate. Not because he was some terrible, awful man. The reality, of course, you and I know, he was the perfect man. He was God. He was wonderful. He was amazing. But because they were upset at him, because they didn't like what he was teaching and what he was doing, they kind of had to make this story up and say, "Oh, Pilate, he's an evil man. He's an awful man. That's why we need to bring him to you." That wasn't the case. They needed to bring him to Pilate because Pilate's the only one that could kill him. They couldn't do it. And so that's why he was taken there. Verses 33 through 40, Jesus is now going to speak a little bit about his kingdom. Pilate's going to ask him some questions, and Jesus is going to answer them. But Jesus is going to revolve it around his kingdom. And so Pilate wants to know something. Pilate says, "Jesus, are you the king of the Jews?" Well, Jesus says, as a very wise response to that. I think this is really good. And of course it would be wise. It's Jesus, right? But Jesus, in his ultimate wisdom, Jesus looks at Pilate and says, "Well, do you want to know? Or did someone else tell you to ask me that?" And so Pilate here, Pilate is trying to ask Jesus some questions, but Pilate really doesn't care about any of this. Pilate's only doing it because the Jews were persistent. And that's exactly the point Jesus was making. Jesus was saying, listen, you don't care who I am. You don't care if I'm the king of the Jews, or you don't care if I am, the reality is you're only doing this because the Jews have brought me to you. And so Jesus is kind of making a point here. Do you really want to know, or is someone else telling you to ask me that? Well, in Jesus' response, Jesus basically claims, he never comes out and says it at this moment, at this point in time, but Jesus basically claims, yes, I am the king of the Jews. And then he says, but not in this world. My kingdom is on high. And so Jesus is saying, listen, you want to know if I'm a king? You want to know if I'm here to establish a kingdom? Jesus says the reality is no, I'm not here to establish my kingdom. Jesus didn't come the first time to establish his kingdom. Jesus came the first time to be the sacrificial lamb. He came with the express purpose of dying upon the cross and then being buried for 3 days and 3 nights and then arising from the dead. That was his purpose. But Jesus says there is a day coming where my kingdom will survive. There is a place on high where my kingdom is, and in that kingdom, I am the king. And so Pilate again asks, Pilate's trying to get a blunt response out of him. Pilate says, come on now, are you a king? And Jesus again responds, well, this is my purpose. My purpose is to be here. My purpose is to be here in this time, in this moment. My purpose is to be here with you. My purpose is to die. And so Jesus is trying to explain all of this to Pilate. Well, now, Pilate, in all this questioning, Pilate can't find anything wrong with him. And so Pilate takes him back to the Jews and says, listen, there's nothing wrong with this guy. Are you sure you want me to arrest him? Are you sure you want me to beat him, to kill him? I mean, are you sure you want to do this? And Pilate kind of chimes in now. He says, listen, I know. Pilate says, every year at Easter, I release one prisoner. So I'm going to release a prisoner. Why don't I just, you've brought him to me. You've arrested him. You've made him a kind of a public figure. You've made a public example out of him. People know that they can't get away with this, or they will be arrested. And you've made your point. Now let me release him to you. Let me release him as part of this ritual that we do at Passover every year, and I will release to you your king, the King of the Jews. But the crowd cries, no, give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a bad dude. He was a bad guy. Barabbas was somebody that got in trouble a lot. He was a robber. He was a thief. He was a murderer. He was somebody that you did not want roaming the streets of Jerusalem. And yet these people were so upset, so angry at Jesus. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, they had all gone around, stirred the crowd up, and now the crowd is crying out, no, keep Jesus, crucify Jesus, give us Barabbas. And so this brings us to the end of chapter number 18 and shows us this stepping stone, this process from when Jesus is first accused and arrested, and now he has been tried, and throughout this illegal trial, now he's brought to the point where Pilate is ready to release him, and the crowd says, no, crucify him, give us Barabbas. Now, if you would, in your Bibles, we're going to be looking at just the first 15 verses of chapter 9, okay? Just the first 15 verses of chapter 19, excuse me. Next week, we will finish chapter 19, and hopefully we'll get through 20 and 21, okay? So hopefully next week we'll be able to hit 2.5 chapters. Let's finish today, let's finish this evening in chapter number 19, all right? Verses 1 through 15. And this is the story of Jesus being delivered to be crucified. So Pilate, Pilate thinks that Jesus is innocent. There's no fault in him. And so Pilate's still of this process, trying to work through all of this himself, saying, listen, he doesn't deserve to die. I don't need to put him on a cross. I know what I'll do. I'll just deliver him to be beaten. I'll take him, I'll have him scourged, I'll have him beaten with a cat o' nine tails. The soldiers can put a crown of thorns upon his head. They can put a purple robe around him. We can mock him. We can smote him with our hands. We can embarrass him. We can humiliate him. We can do all of these things. And then when we're all done, I'm going to bring him before the people, which is exactly what he did. And Pilate brought him before the people, and Pilate said this. Pilate said, "Isn't this enough? I found no fault in this man. Let me just release him to you. I've already beaten him. I've put the crown of thorns upon him. I've smote him. I mean, everything. This is enough. Just accept this. Let me release him, and you can have him back, and he can survive." But now here we're at this point. The crowd's now shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate once again reiterated, there's no fault in this man. There's nothing that he's done. But the Jews said, no, there is something that he's done. He's made himself to be God. And for this, the Jews said, he must die. Now here's the reality. You and I today, we would actually agree with the Jew. He did make himself to be God. And because he made himself to be God, he was the Messiah. And being the Messiah, he was perfect. And being that he was perfect, he was the perfect lamb to be sacrificed for our sins. The reality is the Jews knew the truth. They just refused to accept it. They knew that Jesus was God, that Jesus claimed to be God. They just refused to accept that he was God. They refused to accept that he was the Messiah. And because they refused to accept it, they shouted out, "Crucify him. He must die." So Pilate, kind of one final ditch effort here. Pilate brings Jesus in, sets Jesus down, and Pilate asks a very interesting question. Pilate asks, whence comest thou? Or let's put it in our language today. Pilate asks, who are you? Now, Pilate's not asking what town Jesus is from or what city he's from. Pilate's not asking, who's your mommy and daddy? Pilate's asking actually a very important question here. Pilate wants to know, Jesus, do you claim to be the Son of Man or the Son of God? That's literally the question that Pilate's asking here. Who are you? Are these people right? Do you claim to be God? Now at this point, Jesus refuses to answer. I think Jesus basically is saying, listen, I've let my word speak for myself. I've already been beaten. I've been beaten within an inch of my life. You know the answer to that question. Are you the Son of Man or are you the Son of God? Jesus says, you know. You know what it is. So Jesus refused to answer, and Pilate kind of gets a little bit angry about that. He gets upset that Jesus doesn't answer him. And so Pilate kind of shouts out, he says, do you know who I am? Do you know that I have the power to kill you or the power to keep you alive? Now Jesus does respond to that. Jesus responds and says, you know what? You have no power unless I give it to you. And indirectly, Jesus is answering the original question from the last chapter. Jesus is answering the original question. Jesus is saying, I am God. If Jesus is the one giving him the power, no one can give Pilate power except who? God. And so indirectly, Jesus is answering that original question. You wanted to know if I was God? Am I the Son of Man or am I the Son of God? I am God. I'm the one that gives you the power to do what you do. So Pilate now brings Jesus before the people. We can see in the other gospel accounts, it records that Pilate washes his hands of the situation. Of course, we know that that was just a ritual. Pilate still held the power to save Jesus or kill Jesus, and Pilate gave the order to crucify him. And Pilate yells to the people, he says, behold your king. And the Jews cry out, we have no king but Caesar. Crucify him. And so this brings us to the end of our lesson today. We're going to pick this up next Wednesday night and hopefully finish out the book of John. Hope that you've enjoyed tonight's lesson. I pray that you would, if you haven't read it yet, go back and read it. Read all of chapter 18 and the first 15 verses of chapter 19. That's what our lesson was on tonight. Thank you for being here this evening. I pray that you have a good week. Continue to stay healthy. If you have any questions, any concerns, if you have any prayer requests, make sure to write me an email, shoot me a text message, give me a phone call. I'm here for you. We love you. We pray for you daily. Hope to see you very, very soon. Have a great night. God bless you.